Ashton always loved books. Growing up, the quiet aisles of libraries had been his sanctuary, and the smell of old paper and ink his refuge. So when he got the chance to work at the university library for the summer, I didn't hesitate. The building itself was a dream come true, a towering, Gothic structure with carved stone gargoyles and stained glass windows that cast eerie hues over the floors on sunny days. Inside, rows of towering bookshelves stretched toward the vaulted ceiling, and there were hidden alcoves just waiting for someone like me to get lost in a novel. My job was simple enough, or so I thought at first. I was responsible for managing the basement archives, a section few dared to visit. Colleagues warned me it had an eerie vibe, with whispers of strange occurrences, but I shrugged it off. I wasn't one to scare easily. I was here for the peace, the quiet, and the smell of centuries-old books. The first few days were uneventful. The basement was dimly lit and dusty, with towering shelves filled with ancient texts, some of which looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. I'd spend my shifts organizing the archives, my footsteps echoing in the vast silence. It was peaceful, even comforting, but then I started noticing something strange. Every now and then, I'd catch sight of a student descending into the basement. Nothing unusual about that, except sometimes one less student would come back up. I'd watch, counting as casually as I could, and yet each time, the numbers didn't add up. I told myself I was just tired, that I'd miscounted, or that they must have found another way out. But the pattern continued. Then came a night I met her. She appeared as if from nowhere, this girl with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, striking in her vintage dress. She looked like she belonged to another time, with an air of mystery I couldn't quite place. She caught my eye and smiled, introducing herself as Claire. Her voice was soft, almost musical, and she spoke in a way that made every word seem carefully chosen. After a brief, polite conversation, she drifted toward the basement stairs. Hours passed, and I didn't see her come back up. As the evening wore on, a sense of unease crept in. My heart beat faster with each minute that ticked by, my mind racing with questions. Where was she? What was keeping her down there so long? I tried to focus on my work, but the thought gnawed at me until I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to make sure she was all right. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down the basement stairs. The silence down there was deeper, thicker, like the shadows had a weight to them. I called out her name, but only the echo of my voice answered. It was as though the library itself was listening, holding its breath. And then, just as I was about to give up, I saw it, a narrow, ancient door hidden behind one of the shelves. Dust covered its surface, and cobwebs clung to the edges, as if it hadn't been touched in ages. My curiosity flared, and I pushed it open, revealing a narrow, winding staircase leading even further down. The air grew colder, staler, and with each step, I felt as though I was descending into a place forgotten by time. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a maze of narrow hallways. The walls were lined with stone, damp with condensation, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and rot. A strange silence enveloped the place, broken only by the faintest sounds, whispers that seemed to dance on the edges of my hearing. "Claire?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. To my surprise, I heard footsteps echoing faintly from somewhere deeper in the labyrinth. I turned a corner, and there she was, standing just at the edge of the shadows. But something was wrong. Her face was different, paler, almost ghostly, and her piercing blue eyes seemed dull, unfocused. She reached out for me, her hand trembling, and whispered for me to follow. I did, of course, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. She led me deeper into the maze, her figure flickering like a candle flame, barely visible in the dim light. My heart pounded in my chest as we passed by ancient relics, shattered stone pillars, fragments of stained glass, rusted chains embedded into the walls. It felt as though we'd wandered into a forgotten world. Finally, I convinced her to come back up with me. Her face was blank, her movements mechanical, as though she were in a trance. When we reached the main floor, she looked at me, confused, disoriented. She couldn't remember her own name, couldn't recall how she'd ended up in the basement. I was left standing there, shaken, as she walked out into the night without another word. I couldn't let it go. That night, I lay awake, replaying every detail of the encounter, trying to make sense of it. The next day, I dove into researching the library's history. Buried in obscure records and forgotten archives, I found a clue, a whisper of the library's darker past. It had once been part of an underground network during the Civil War, a secret passageway for soldiers and refugees, some of whom had reportedly never returned. Somehow those people, the lost ones, still lingered. The library wasn't just a place for books. It was a place of echoes, of memories trapped between the walls, of souls who'd wandered too far and couldn't find their way back. I wanted to believe it was all just stories, that what I'd seen could be rationally explained. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Claire's ghostly face, heard her whispering voice calling to me from the shadows. It was as if the library itself was alive, hungry, waiting for the next soul to wander too deep into its depths. Finally, I quit. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd barely escaped with my own sanity. But sometimes, even now, when I pass by the library late at night, I swear I can see her, just a shadow, flickering by the basement window, waiting for someone else to follow her down into the darkness. I can still remember the first time I found it, wedged awkwardly between two dusty textbooks on the back shelf of the library. It was a diary, but not just any diary. The leather was worn, almost soft to the touch, yet somehow still held an edge, as if it had absorbed the memories within too deeply. The initials EB were scratched into the corner, barely visible. Something about it drew me in, as if it had waited years just for me. Miss Carmichael was on duty that day, her gaze moving around the room like a hawk's, as she checked that everyone was silent and focused. I snuck back to my seat with the diary hidden under my jacket, my pulse racing with a mixture of guilt and thrill. Once I was alone in my dorm room, I slipped it out and opened it. The pages were brittle, like ancient leaves that might crumble at any touch. I turned them gently, catching glimpses of a life that had unfolded right here, within these same walls. She, whoever she was, had a beautiful, precise script, full of curly loops and slanted letters. Her words revealed loneliness, the kind that I had felt too, isolated, lost in the endless echoing hallways of the school. I started to read, fascinated, and was startled to see the date at the top of each entry, 1962. The girl in the diary, Elizabeth, I learned, spoke of strange things. She'd write about a voice, a whisper she'd sometimes hear when she was alone. She described it as gentle at first, then louder and more insistent. "It's a friend," she wrote in one entry. "Someone who understands me better than anyone else." But as the entries continued, her tone shifted. She talked about the voice asking her to do things, silly things at first, like rearranging her books or hiding her shoes. Yet soon, Elizabeth spoke of fear. After a week, I couldn't get her out of my head. Elizabeth's words were like a spell, wrapping tighter around me with each line I read. It wasn't until I started hearing the voice myself that I realized something was wrong. It began softly, just as Elizabeth had described. I'd be lying in bed, half asleep, when I'd hear it, a faint whispering, as if someone were reading Elizabeth's words out loud. Sometimes, I thought I could almost feel her, like a shadow, a fleeting presence that filled the empty spaces around me. At first, I was convinced it was only my imagination, just a byproduct of immersing myself too deeply in her world. But the whisper grew louder, more insistent, as the nights went on. One evening, I glanced in the mirror and saw myself looking back, but not as myself. I looked older, worn down, with hollow eyes that didn't seem like my own. Elizabeth's words kept filling my mind. It felt like she was slipping into me, settling beneath my skin. My friends started noticing too. They'd laugh it off at first, asking why I was speaking so formally or why I sometimes seemed like I wasn't quite there. But I couldn't stop myself. I'd catch myself saying things in a voice that didn't sound like my own, using words and phrases that felt foreign. My handwriting, too, began to change, curling into the neat, perfect loops of Elizabeth's script. The voice urged me to write, to trace the letters exactly as she had. One night, I couldn't resist anymore. I took the diary to the same library corner where I'd found it and began writing. "Help me," I wrote, over and over. And as I wrote, the words seemed to come to life, echoing around me in a murmur that was half my voice and half hers. I glanced up, terrified, as I realized I was no longer alone. Miss Carmichael must have seen something strange, because she appeared out of nowhere, her face pale. She caught me whispering in that voice, Elizabeth's voice, and she looked horrified. "Sarah," she said, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" But it wasn't me who answered. I felt Elizabeth take over entirely, a force inside me speaking in her tone, her sorrow, her anger. Miss Carmichael clutched her cross, her hands trembling. "Elizabeth," she whispered, as if she could see the girl within me. She grabbed the diary, her hands firm, and said, "Sarah, you have to let her go." I fought against the feeling, but it was as if Elizabeth's spirit was clawing desperately, holding on. My mouth moved, and the voice that came out was barely my own. "Don't burn it," I pleaded. "No," she pleaded. I felt her fear, her desperation to stay in the only place she had left. But Miss Carmichael didn't hesitate. She took me to the school's incinerator room, where the air was thick with the scent of burnt paper and metal. She opened the door, held the diary over the flames, and looked at me one last time. "I'm sorry, Sarah." As the flames licked at the leather, I felt a searing pain in my chest, as though a piece of me were being torn away. Elizabeth's voice screamed, an echoing cry that reverberated in the dark, abandoned places of my mind. And then silence. She was gone. I staggered back, feeling hollow, as though I'd lost a part of myself. Miss Carmichael watched me closely, her face both relieved and deeply sad. She whispered, "Some spirits are bound, Sarah, and some bindings must be broken." The diary was gone, but I still hear whispers in the hallways sometimes. The way the wind howls at night sounds almost like a girl's voice. And once, I caught a glimpse of a figure out of the corner of my eye, just a shadow, but a shadow that seemed to be waiting, watching. Elizabeth never really left. She's still here, in the creaks of the floorboards, in the shifting shadows cast by the library's dim lights. And one day, I know she'll find another reader, someone else to tell her secrets to, someone who might listen just a little too closely as I did.